Hello, and welcome to the 8th episode of Season 10 of the Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I am Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend and business partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Ray.
Graham, in a way, we're going back to basics today. We're going to look at the crucial topic of beneficial ownership.
And why are we doing that, Ray?
Well, because of a listener, Graham, who asked me which episode we'd covered it in. And that caused me to go and check our archives. And although we've talked around the topic a bit, we've never considered it comprehensively. So I promised we would.
And we absolutely should. And of course, beneficial ownership is key to the business of our sponsor, isn't it?
Well, yes. If you're a fund manager keeping track of individual investors across multiple countries, each with their own laws and regulatory frameworks, you'll know the work is not only incredibly challenging and time-consuming, it's downright dangerous.
And it's why bad actors can continue to operate in the dark. But with a product by Deeppool called Cure, K-U-R-E, you can pull all relevant information from any system in the world into a single point, a single global investor record, so that your institution isn't at risk of the damage they cause. Save yourself from risk, as well as complexity and wasting time, by going to deep-pool.com.
Good plan. Back to beneficial ownership then. Graham, why don't you outline why we get so exercised about this? Why, in short, is beneficial ownership important?
Well, let's go right back to basics, Ray. Financial criminals want to conceal their identity. Firstly, of course, they don't want to get linked to the crime they've committed and thereby lose their liberty.
I don't blame them.
Well, yeah, quite. I mean, yeah. But of course, the whole framework of AML regulations is that the financial firms receiving, managing and paying out money know exactly who they're doing it for, and this cuts right through the criminals' objectives. Criminals, of course, were happier when banks asked no questions and just got on with doing as they were asked.
Well, of course they were. So, because to take a notorious example, you'd never look after an account in the name of the criminal Ronnie Biggs. Ronnie would have to wrap himself up in a company, let's call it Railtrack Enterprises, that the banks would not have associated with him and would have no reason to associate with him.
Ronnie Biggs, that's a wow. Yes, and up to a point, that used to work. Before the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, introduced their recommendations, and it's hard to remember that even their formation was only 34 years ago. Right? Banks didn't have to do anything like the corporate due diligence we take for granted now.
But it could still work for Ronnie today, couldn't it?
Well, it could, I suppose, but as we'll see, he'll find it much, much harder to hide behind a corporation today.
OK then, so why do we talk about beneficial ownership rather than just ownership?
Now that is a really key question here, Ray, because it speaks to some of the tricks that Ronnie might have tried when things started to get tougher. In a legal sense, we talk about two contrasting categories of ownership: legal ownership and beneficial ownership.
Now, legal ownership, I guess, is what the paperwork says. Who is the officially registered, recorded, documented owner of an asset?
That is exactly right.
So when my parents bought their first house in the 1970s, it wasn't unusual for the house to be bought in the name solely of the man. My dad was the legal owner of the family home, although my mum lived there too.
Not, as you say, uncommon, Ray. Now, did your mum contribute to the cost of running the house?
Yeah, of course. They both worked at times, and when she was unable to work because she had a young child, she contributed in other ways, doing the day-to-day cooking, cleaning and so on. This happened a lot in the 1970s.
And probably still does today, Ray. However, the law would say that although your dad was the sole legal owner of the house, that's what the property deeds said, actually they owned it jointly as beneficial owners.
So the law would recognise my mum's entitlement to her fair share.
Yes, it absolutely would. Now, much of the time there's no difference between the legal owner and the beneficial owner of an asset. You own it, you're the only user, it's yours to do with as you wish.
You're most kind.
But along with the case of your mum and dad, there are all sorts of situations in which the legal owner and the beneficial owner of an asset are different.
And primary among those is a corporation. It's owned, depending on its legal form, by shareholders or partners, typically.
Yep, we have to add one more word to align our definition of ownership with what the regulations say, and that is ultimate.
Ah, yes, UBOs, ultimate beneficial owners. Now, we know what beneficial means, but what the ultimate adds to that is that we have to find the individual person or persons who sit at the end of a possibly long trail.
And why a long trail, Ray?
Well, let's say that the corporation is owned by another corporation. You can do that. We've not yet found an ultimate beneficial owner, though, because to do that, we'd need to find actual people.
Okay, so if the corporation is owned by another corporation, we'd need to see who owns that corporation, because indirectly, they will end up owning the first one as well, right?
That's exactly right. And to get right down to people who account for every share of the corporation might be quite a detailed and convoluted exercise, especially if somewhere there are criminal person or persons unknown trying to make it harder for you.
Yes. Now, to be clear, this kind of complexity isn't necessarily from criminal origin, is it, Ray?
No, most of the time, in fact, it's not going to be. But doing this fully every time is how we make it impossible for a criminal to slip through.
Oh, I think impossible is quite a strong word, Ray.
Well, fair point, Graham. Should we go with all but impossible or largely infeasible? I mean, those Mission Impossible chaps have committed this particular inaccuracy at least 7 times now, and no one's on their backs about it.
Well, that's true. I think we can possibly let you off this time.
Okay, well, look, anyway, if we're going to look through all these layers of corporate ownership, isn't this in the end a straightforward, if laborious, exercise?
Well, often, yes, definitely. But sometimes there are, some interesting hurdles.
And I fear that here, Graham, you're using the word interesting in the way that, say, Hannibal Lecter would have.
I suppose I am, right?
Oh, don't do that.
Sorry about that. Thought I did rather a good job. Because while those corporations are in the UK or in countries with similarly transparent and accessible ownership records, it's easy to get the information. But some or all of them might not be.
No, you might come across at any point in the ownership chain a company set up in a secrecy location, where the rules of the jurisdiction mean that you're not entitled to be told who owns that company, even if you have a legitimate interest in knowing.
That is very true, and lots of corporate ownership structures have one of these somewhere. It might be for legitimate, non-criminal reasons, and usually it will be.
But if we're onboarding this customer, we still need to identify the UBOs. And to do that, we need to know who owns this offshore entity, don't we?
We do, and although we can't find out from an official registry, which would make things easy for us, we can ask the customer, who absolutely should know who owns part or all of it, to tell us and give us evidence of the actual owners.
Well, they might not want to. After all, there's probably a reason why a secrecy location was used. Someone wants their ownership or involvement kept private.
And they are perfectly entitled to keep it private as far as the rest of the world is concerned. But if they want to have or keep a relationship with a regulated firm, then they need to pony up to that firm and rely on the confidentiality the firm has to provide.
And if they won't, Graham?
Well, then the regulated firm has a decision to make. They might decide that not knowing places the customer outside their risk appetite, so they can't have them as a customer. Or they may be able to find some other way of getting comfortable with not knowing.
Yeah, now the regulation in most countries gives them a way to do this, doesn't it? Having taken reasonable measures to determine the ownership, they can record the steps they've taken, including those they've attempted but that haven't been conclusive, and record their rationale for accepting or keeping the customer nevertheless.
It's an option you wouldn't want to rely on perhaps very often, but where you perceive that the risk is low and you're confident your controls are primed and effective, it can be a useful option.
So really, we're down, that option aside, to tracing the names and holdings of every shareholder or equivalent, aren't we? All the way through the structure until we have just actual people.
Well, yes, mostly. But if we can do that, then what we have is the ultimate legal owners because we'd have captured the people whose names are on the certificates.
Yes, and as we saw earlier, legal owners might not be the beneficial owners.
Absolutely right, Ray. Shall we think about some of the common situations where there might be a difference between who is the legal owner of a shareholding and who is the beneficial owner?
Yeah, let's. One that immediately occurs to me is the nominee shareholder, where the person on the certificate is only acting as a proxy for the real owner.
And that really is quite common. I have some shares which I held in a proxy because it's just easier to do it that way. But where it is the case, firms have to know that and they have to understand who the beneficial owner is behind that nominee.
But how can you know? It's just a name on a certificate or in a register, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And here what's in our favour and makes all this practical is that we don't have to identify all the beneficial owners, just those who own directly or indirectly, more than 25% usually, of the corporate that is our customer.
And that's a concept and a number that I'm sure our listeners are very familiar with. But why does it help us when it comes to spotting a nominee, Graham?
Well, first of all, it means that you'll only have to worry in most cases about a small number of people, rarely more than 3 or 4 for a customer.
Well, that's useful.
And also because if they own such a substantial chunk of the company, who they are ought to make some kind of sense.
So if you have a name that appears only in the register, that hasn't been part of the relationship with or the application to your firm, who are they? What's their connection to the firm? And maybe what source of wealth gives rise to the means to own such a chunk?
You've got it, Ray. And again, there could be legitimate reasons for having a nominee, but that doesn't mean we don't have to look behind them anyway.
Quite right. Now, there are a few legal situations, aren't there, where you might have different legal versus beneficial ownership. So, for instance, a trustee holds assets in their own right as legal owner, but has no beneficial ownership or entitlement of their own, and you'd need to look through the trust to find the UBOs there. Or an administrator or a receiver in the case of someone who's bankrupt.
Yes, and these can all happen and need to be identified and resolved.
OK, so are we there now?
Not quite, Ray. I think we need to look a little more closely at that 25% rule and see how the wrong uns might try to exploit it.
OK, good idea. If you're not keen on being identified as a UBO, there are a few things you can do, even if you own a fair chunk or even all of the company. Remember, the rule in most jurisdictions is that a person holds more than 25%. So if there are 4 equal owners, none of them technically triggers the threshold.
That is right. So if you can find at least 3 chums,
or family members.
Yes, or family members who will be shareholders in name only and follow your instructions, you might think you can fly under the radar.
And can you?
It used to be easier. Now most jurisdictions have a rule that says in positions like this, you can't just declare that there are no UBOs. You have to find and identify an accountable person.
And who would that be?
Well, in the absence of anyone else, it will be the person having effective day-to-day control of the business. Often, this will be the CEO or the general manager.
And then, in the process of checking out this person and their background, you'd expect any difficult connections to become clearer.
Okay then, so you can try to dilute a large holding by sharing it out among people who are connected. Now, if you can see those connections, like a husband and wife holding 20% each, you might decide to aggregate that as a family block and treat both as UBOs.
Always?
No, I wouldn't say so. If you could evidence them coming by their holdings independently, for instance, or you see a track record of them voting differently from one another in AGM minutes, pre the divorce, you might conclude they are acting separately and independently. But if the opposite pertains...
yeah, point taken. Now, you raised the issue of voting there, Graham, and this can be a factor as well in the hunt for UBOs, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely can, Ray. If you wanted to set yourself up as a corporate éminence grise, as it were, directing things from the shadows, one way to do it would be to give yourself special shares. So a small number of these, which might represent, let's say, 5% of the company's shares, could carry all of the voting rights. Now, if you set it up so that you owned all of those shares, you'd be able to completely control the company, even though you had just a small minority percentage shareholding.
And that's why the UBO rule has both ownership and control tests. You'll be regarded as a UBO if you have more than 25% of the voting rights, even if you don't have 25% of the share ownership.
Okay, but how would we know if there's a difference, Ray, when we onboard the company?
Well, the foundational documents for the company would tell you if you read them closely, but there'll be other clues as well. Typically, if you or I hold shares in a company, these will be called ordinary shares in the UK and many other countries on the certificate. If they're not called that, you might see reference in the name of the shares to voting, to NV or non-voting, to Series B shares and the like. And all of these things can tip you off that the capital and the voting rights might not be directly equivalent. So then you can go and dig a bit.
Great, so I think I've got that. So to be a UBO of a company then, you need to meet one or more of these conditions. First, that you own, directly or indirectly, more than 25% of the capital of the company.
Or more than 25% of the voting rights.
Or you're closely associated or related to someone else who has shares, that you treat the holdings as a joint one and act together, and together it crosses the 25% threshold.
Or nobody qualifies mathematically and you happen to be the bloke in effective day-to-day control of the business.
That seems to cover all the bases then.
Well, not quite, Graham.
Oh no. What now?
Well, I want us to think a bit more about control just for a minute. And I'm going to build a little scenario.
Well, go on then.
Right. Now, I start a flour mill business. It grinds wheat and other grain, packages it up and sells it to bakers. I own 60% of this business and the shares are all ordinary throughout this example, okay?
Okay.
Now, clearly, I would be a UBO of the flour mill business.
Yes.
But bear with me. The flour mill business itself buys a controlling stake in a bakery business. I believe they call that vertical integration, Graham.
Oh.
It now owns 60% of a high street bakery.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Now, what proportion of the bakery business do I own indirectly?
You own 60% of 60% of it.
That's right, or 36%. So I'm also a UBO of the bakery business.
I get it, yep.
Next step. The bakery business itself now buys a controlling interest in a cafe selling cakes.
Oh, that's a clever move.
Yeah, in more ways than one, as we'll see. But the bakery now owns 60% of the cafe business. So, what is my stake in the cafe business?
Oh, come on. Okay, let me just think about this. So you own 60% of the flour mill, which owns 60% of the bakery, which in turn owns 60% of the cafe.
Yep.
So you own 60% of 60% of 60% of the cafe.
which is 21.6%, Graham.
Oh, good maths, Ray. So, all right, so 21.6%, you're not a UBO then?
No. Except.
Except what?
Well, think about it, Graham. Who's in charge of the cafe and everything it does?
Well, you and the other shareholders.
Look again. Who in that structure can stop me or vote me down in any way?
Well, nobody, because at every level in the ownership chain, you have majority control.
I do indeed. So I would argue that whatever the some say, I exercise effective control of the cafe and ought to be regarded as its UBO.
I hate to say this, but I think I agree with you, Ray.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah. Now, just one more... I keep saying this. It's the Colombo close, isn't it? Just one more thing to look at here before we've built a definitive list of what can make you a UBO.
Yeah, I'm going to have to keep one eye on you then, aren't I?
Oh, very good.
Yeah. So is this the significant control by other means piece?
It is indeed, Graham. Do you want to explain this one?
I'm happy to. Let's use an example everyone will be familiar with, and that is Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft.
Big fan of his work, Graham.
Okay, it's good to hear that, Ray. How much of Microsoft does he currently own, Ray?
None at all, Graham.
Absolutely right, Ray. Not a bee, not even indirectly. But do we believe he can't still exercise some control in what happens at Microsoft, how it spends money and the goals it pursues?
Well, no, I imagine he can get a meeting with anyone in the company at the drop of a hat, Graham. These are people he probably identified and promoted when he was in charge. There are people at Microsoft who owe Bill Gates everything.
So despite zero ownership, it might be as well to regard him as a UBO of Microsoft Corporation?
I agree, but that's a well-known example where the influence is very visible. How would that work if you're onboarding a company you've never heard of?
Well, there are a few things you can do, but for me, the most reliable way is to run news searches, not just general web searches, but specifically news searches, and scan through the first few you find in which names appear. Check those names against the directors and UBOs that you do know about.
And then, if someone new tends to keep cropping up in the stories that's not on your list, ask about their role? Have a bit of a dig around?
Well, that's what I would do, Ray, yes.
So, look, Graham, I think we've pretty much covered the basics of corporate beneficial ownership here. But there's a fair bit more to think about beyond this.
Yes, I mean, we've not even looked at exchange-listed companies yet, have we?
No. So, how do you feel about a follow-up episode where we explore this even more deeply?
Well, that's okay. I need to refine my voice because I'm just recovering from a bout of COVID, in case you're wondering why I sound quite so squeaky. And I think I'm going to need some fresh batteries from my torch.
I'm looking forward to it.